This is the story of the Flying Fortress, a machine built to dominate the skies, yet flying it was pure terror. Imagine being trapped with 9 other men inside an unpressurized metal shell 25,000 feet above Europe, where the temperature drops to -60, and just removing your oxygen mask for a moment could leave you unconscious in minutes. Before you faced flak or enemy fighters, a single mistake assembling into formation could end everything. Countless crews lost before a shot was ever fired. Why did these missions become journeys to hell and back, and how did young crews find the courage to return? To understand why flying the B-17 was so horrific, we need to step inside and feel the fortress turn hostile from the very first moment. At 18,000 feet, the B-17 became a frozen world cut off from comfort or safety. The moment the aircraft leveled off at altitude, the temperature inside dropped to -60 Fahrenheit. Crew members wore thick layers of wool and electrically heated suits, but even these were unreliable. Early in the war, the suit wiring often broke at the elbows and knees, leaving entire sections cold and useless. If the suit failed, frostbite set in within minutes. Exposed skin would freeze so quickly that blood from a wound could turn solid before it hit the floor. Fingers stiffened, faces burned from the cold, and sometimes, the only way to keep hands working was to pull them inside sleeves and risk losing grip on the guns. Oxygen masks were not optional. At this altitude, a man could lose consciousness in less than 5 minutes without his mask. The air was so thin that one missed connection or a frozen hose meant blacking out before anyone could notice. Sometimes, moisture from breath would freeze inside the rubber tubes, blocking the flow entirely. Crewmen squeezed their hoses constantly, trying to break up the ice, all while keeping watch for enemy fighters or flak bursts. The cold invaded every corner of the bomber. Metal surfaces became so frigid that bare skin stuck instantly. The waist gunners, standing at open windows, felt the slipstream howl around them at 200 miles an hour. Electric boots and gloves were supposed to help, but when the circuits failed, toes and fingers went numb, then dead white. In the radio compartment, wires could snap from the cold, cutting off communication. The ball turret gunner, crammed in his sphere below the fuselage, had little room to move, and if his suit failed, there was nowhere to escape the chill. Hours before reaching enemy territory, the crew was already fighting a silent, invisible enemy. The fortress itself, turning hostile as it climbed higher. Every mission started with this ordeal. Before a single shot was fired, before the first burst of flak or glimpse of a fighter, the men were already exhausted, faces rimed with frost, muscles aching from the constant effort to stay warm and alert. The B-17's promise of strength and protection faded with every breath drawn through a freezing mask, every minute spent in the unyielding cold. Survival meant not just outlasting the enemy, but enduring the fortress itself. Takeoff began before dawn, each B-17 rolling down the runway at precisely 30-second intervals, engines roaring as the next aircraft surged forward. The sky above England quickly became a maze of climbing bombers, each one loaded with fuel and bombs, banking into a slow spiral to find its place in the formation. Pilots juggled stick and throttle, eyes darting between altimeter, airspeed, and the glint of other fortresses circling in the gloom. With dozens of bombers airborne at once, the risk of collision was never theoretical. One misjudged turn or a moment's distraction could mean disaster. In the confusion, aircraft sometimes drifted too close, wingtips nearly touching as prop wash from the lead ships tossed trailing planes in unpredictable currents. Assembly points, marked by radio beacons known as bunchers, offered a reference, but weather and poor visibility often forced crews to rely on instinct and brief flashes of navigation lights. Formation assembly could take an hour or more, burning through precious fuel before the group even set course for enemy territory. During training alone, as many as 2,800 airmen were lost to mid-air collisions and accidents while learning these maneuvers. The pilots' hands never left the controls as they fought to hold position, knowing that a single lapse could send 2 bombers tumbling from the sky. Only once the combat boxes locked into place did the long outbound cruise begin, every fortress now part of a tight, shifting latticework of aluminum and nerves, heading east toward the real battle that waited beyond the channel. German flak was never a matter of luck. Each burst that rocked a B-17 came from a system designed for precision. The Würzburg radar tracked bomber formations with a pencil-thin beam, measuring range to within 25 meters and feeding that data directly to the Kommandogerät 40, a mechanical brain that solved the math of moving targets. This fire control computer predicted where a bomber would be when the shell arrived, then transmitted those calculations to the gun crews. Fuse setters dialed in the exact number of seconds before detonation, matching the shell's flight time to the altitude and speed of the formation overhead. The 88mm shell, with its 4-meter lethal radius, was timed to burst right where the bombers would fly. But even with this technology, the margin for error was razor-thin. At high altitude, a fuse set just 1 second off could make the difference between a close call and a direct hit. Navigators watched as black puffs appeared at their exact altitude, sometimes so close the shockwave rattled teeth and sent shrapnel slicing through aluminum. The science behind each burst stripped away any sense of randomness. Every shell was a calculated threat, and every crew knew it was only a matter of time before the math caught up to them. Each time the formation neared a flak belt, the tension inside a B-17 climbed to a breaking point. The first bursts usually exploded hundreds of yards away, black puffs hanging in the sky. But then the pattern would tighten. The next volley might be close enough to rattle the windows, peppering the fuselage with shrapnel that tore through aluminum and flesh without warning. Inside, the crew gripped their stations, unable to take cover or fight back. The only defense was to hold course, straight and level, so the bombardier could guide the bombs onto the target. For those minutes, nobody moved. Eyes fixed on the instruments, hands frozen on the controls, men waited for the next blast, knowing any shell could be the one that tore the fortress apart. Crewmen watched helplessly as fortresses nearby vanished in sudden flashes or broke apart, trailing fire. Sometimes a wing would shear off, or a ball of flame would swallow the tail. The randomness was absolute. One bomber might pass through untouched, while the one beside it exploded mid-air. On a single run, entire crews disappeared in seconds, leaving only a gap in the formation. Survivors described the sound of shrapnel slicing through the skin of the plane, the metallic ping of fragments ricocheting inside compartments, and the sickening thud when a shell burst close enough to send shockwaves through the cabin. There was no skill, no warning, just the luck of which square in the sky you happened to occupy when the shells arrived. For those who made it through, the memory of those minutes, waiting, exposed, never faded. German fighters did not attack B-17s at random. They came in with precision and purpose, searching for the bombers' weak spots. Early in the war, Luftwaffe pilots tried their luck from the rear, but the fortress's tail guns and overlapping fields of fire made that approach costly and often ineffective. Analysis of downed bombers showed it could take as many as 20 20mm cannon hits to bring down a B-17 from behind, while the average fighter carried only a few hundred rounds. Accuracy rates in combat hovered around 2%, so most attackers never got close to that number before having to break off. The real breakthrough came when German aces like Egon Meyer developed the head-on attack. Closing speeds shot past 500 miles per hour. At that velocity, a fighter and bomber rushed toward each other so quickly that the entire engagement lasted less than a second. Instead of a long, drawn-out duel, both sides had a split second to react. For the B-17 crew, that meant the nose gunners faced the impossible, tracking a blur that flashed into range and was gone almost instantly. In those brief moments, 4 or 5 well-placed 20mm shells could rip through the cockpit, engines, or control systems, enough to cripple or kill a flying fortress in a single pass. To counter this, the top turret and tail gunners had to scan constantly, calling out incoming fighters and trying to lay down suppressing fire as the enemy closed from above, below, or the flanks. German pilots exploited every blind spot, diving in from the 12 o'clock position or curving in from the sides where defensive arcs overlapped less. Each attack forced the crew to split their focus, never knowing which angle would bring the next burst of cannon fire. The speed and violence of these head-on passes left little margin for error. One moment of distraction and an entire crew could be lost before anyone squeezed the trigger. Waist gunners stood at the edge of survival, gripping twin .50 caliber guns at open windows while the slipstream tore the warmth from their bodies. Their world narrowed to a strip of frozen metal with only a thin skin of aluminum between them and the sky. There was no armor, no seat, and little cover from the blasts and shrapnel that ripped through the fuselage. When flak or fighters struck, these gunners were often the first to be hit and the first to bleed. In some cases, the force of an explosion would throw a man across the compartment or pin him beneath wreckage. For those caught in a gear-up landing, the risk of being crushed was real. There was nowhere to run, nowhere safe to hide. The ball turret gunner faced a different kind of terror. Locked into a glass sphere beneath the plane, he was cut off from the rest of the crew, his knees drawn to his chest, hands locked on the triggers. The parachute was stored inside the fuselage, out of reach. If the hydraulics failed, the turret could not align with the hatch, trapping the gunner inside. A belly landing meant certain death. Even with everything working, escape was a desperate scramble against time and panic. The pilot bore the weight of every decision. When the Fortress took a hit, he had seconds to judge the damage. Could they limp home on 2 engines, or was bailout the only hope? Sometimes the call came too late. There were missions where only a single man made it out alive. Statistically, just 1 in 4 crew members finished a full tour. For the rest, the odds ran out somewhere over enemy territory, in the cold or in the fire. Survival was never guaranteed. It was borrowed, 1 mission at a time. 1 in 4 B-17 crew members completed their tour, an official statistic that underscores just how deadly these missions were. Over enemy territory, radar-directed flak and German fighters added layers of lethal unpredictability, as confirmed by mission debriefs and aircrew diaries. Despite advances in defensive armament and formation tactics, military records show that loss rates for bomber crews remained among the highest of the war. Some details, such as the precise number of mid-air collisions or the full psychological toll, remain incomplete or locked in classified files. Today, the B-17 endures as a symbol not just of American industrial might, but of the extreme danger and courage required of those who flew it. The facts make clear: in the skies over Europe, survival was never guaranteed.